Lord, you fasted for 40 days and 40 nights for our justification. Give us that kind of discipline in our sanctification. Amen. We're in Canon Richard Dixon's History of the Church of England, Volume 1. We're picking up here a discussion of what's going on in the Commons and Parliament regarding heretics in the early Henrician period. The Commons will be perceived were not against heretics, or Catholics, remonstrating against the severities exercised in defense of the faith, which still held by the realm. Part of their complaint was that the heretics had gone too far, to a frantic pitch of audacity and violence. And against the Ordinaries, they alleged not that they withstood them, but there was too much severity, too little charity in their opposition. The heretics would have fared no better at the hands of Commons than they fared with the Ordinaries. Indeed, the Commons demanded severer laws against them. Their real object was the removal of the spiritual jurisdiction. Okay, we'll get on to the next. The readiest way to redress the severities already in practice would have been to repeal their own heresy laws in accordance with the Ordinaries, ever spurred on by royal proclamations, had been compelled to proceed. And 2 years afterwards, they certainly did repeal one of the Lancastrian edicts, which first brought the blood of heretics upon the realm. But they left the severest of those laws unrepealed, and their present supplication led to nothing but the depression of the clergy. Not a stake of the lust was set in the ground when the clergy had bent to the storm for the dreadful punishment of a few who dared to die for their opinions. Not a faggot the more was spared the shoulders of many who began that warfare without counting the cost. Nor ought it to escape notice that in the long and elaborate exposure of the ecclesiastical courts, which is contained in the memorial, there is made no mention of easy compositions which the clergy often obtained there for immorality, ill discipline, and unthriftiness. Much has been made by modern writers of this alleged abuse. Examples of great vice, lightly punished, have been culled out of the diocesan registers and set in array to adduce the conclusion that the clerical order was generally depraved. But these examples are not numerous in comparison with the whole number of clergy, nor as far as I have examined do the punishments appear so very light. They all involve public disgrace and the payment of a sum, which may have been heavy on the offender. And if a great public scandal had been caused by these proceedings, it would not have escaped notice here. There is nothing in the supplication which amounts to a general accusation of immorality against the clergy. And this is a strong negative proof that they had not fallen into such a state as to make them abominable in the eyes of the nation. This fashionable view is but little sustained by the trustworthy documents of the time. The real drift of the swollen grievances of the Commons was in their first article. They aimed to destroy the spiritual jurisdiction, to deprive the spirituality of the power of making canons or spiritual laws on the allegation that the spiritual laws which they made were contrary to the dignity of the crown and the statutes of the realm. We've got a couple of footnotes. A great number of cases of incontinency are given in the chapter book of Ripon, printed by the Surtees Society. They are both lay and clerical, both clergy and laymen, usually compounded by a fine. The fines levied on the clergy were no lighter than those on the laymen. Another footnote, there is the allusion to the young folk, whom the Ordinaries called their nephews or kinfolk. Mr. Froude, in noticing this allusion, says, whom the bishops called their nephews. An ordinary was not really necessarily a bishop. I ventured to say that if a general accusation could have been brought against the clergy, it would have been brought by this instrument. It may be answered that the supplication was not against the clergy, but the ordinaries. Back to the text. But they offered no collection of the canon law, nor brought forward a single instance of the contrariety which was alleged. The convocation of the clergy of Canterbury, when the thunderbolt of the Commons fell upon them, were actually engaged in making canons, a body of new laws chiefly concerning the reformation of abuses, had been slowly growing under their hands during the previous sessions, and had now nearly attained their final form. These laws would have been sufficient, if they had been enforced, to have freed the Church from the worst of her corruptions, while they preserved her ancient jurisdiction. They never became laws upon her authority. The power of making laws was taken from her before they could pass through such assemblies. In this, as in so many other things, the clerical reformation was stopped by violence. But to cast a glance upon the last attempt at independent ecclesiastical legislation in this realm may not be unentertaining to the curious, nor uninstructive to the serious student of history. Archbishops and bishops were to show themselves the glory and example of the flock. The frequent absences of many of those great officers, and the management of their dioceses by the inferior deputies, was indeed a most serious evil. It lay at the root of many of the irregularities which the age complained. It excused, while it fostered, remissness in the clergy. Some more footnotes. While the English Church still owned herself a daughter of Rome, it would have been difficult for them to have made such a collection. Cranmer made one after the abolition of Roman power, chiefly consisting of canons confessing the Roman superiority. Burnet, Collection, Book 3. Another footnote, Wilkins, Volume 3, wrongly places these statutes et ordinationes praelatorum in concilio provinciale edita under the year 1529. They were no doubt agitated then, as they were again in 1530, but they were brought to the form in which we have them preserved in 1532. Back to the text. It filled the diocesan courts with oppressions and exactions of middlemen. They were exhorted and admonished by the Convocation to be present in their sees on the principal feasts, or at least at Christmas, Easter, Whit Sunday, and Holy Week, to make visitations through their dioceses, reforming the monasteries and hospitals, correcting the clergy and people, in conferring orders and instituting the benefices. They were more careful than hitherto to restrain liberty of absence and altogether take away the leasing of livings for money. The exactions and severities of their own officials they were to check. Throughout their dioceses they were to send forth proper and able teachers to put down heresies and errors, and be diligent in seeking out heretical books. At the monastic schools, not less than the universities, or the seminaries of the faith, was the duty to restore the abbots and the rest of the religious to strictness of the monastic conversation. Clerical delinquents were to be more severely brought to order. Proprietaries, rectors, and vicars to be compelled to make cause, or cause to be made, frequent sermons in their churches, not to neglect the due distributions among the parochial poor. The simoniacal deposed, the carnal castigate, the sumptuous apparel reduced to a prescribed vesture. The hunters and hawkers among the clergy, recalled to graver conversation, might have lessened, if that were ever possible, the mark of envy in the ministers of the church. Of the manners and learning of the churchmen and management of the church, some curious particulars may be gathered from these ordinances, which branch out largely upon more special abuses. No person was to be ordained a subdeacon unless he were sufficiently exercised in the Gospels and Epistles, or at least in those contained in the Missal, to be able readily to give the grammatical sense of them to an examiner. The practice of appearing by proxy to be instituted in a living was forbidden. All who sought institution were to appear personally before the bishop or vicar general, because among other reasons, religious persons were wont to come by proxy, representing themselves as secular clerics. In this way, it seems, was the statute of Richard II evaded, by which it was ordered to prevent the vicarages which the monasteries had acquired from being filled by monks, and all such benefices should be served by none but the secular clergy. They were beneficed men again who absented themselves on the false pretense of study. The ordinaries were to inquire strictly after such men, and a corporal oath was to be taken of the authorities of the universities that they would hunt them out of the colleges, halls, and hospitals. To avoid idleness, the mother of all vices, all curates, rectors, vicars, chantry, and stipendiary priests, besides their daily offices, were ordered to employ themselves in studies, prayer, readings, or other good works, especially in the instruction of boys in spelling, reading, grammar, and singing. And 3 days in the week they were to spend 3 or at least 2 hours in the study of the Holy Scriptures, or some approved doctor, and idle priests were to be severely reprimanded. Hi, here's Paige. It was announced that a design, which had been for some time on foot, would soon be accomplished, of publishing grammar by authority for the use of the entire province of Canterbury. At present, the diversity of methods was a disadvantage to the pupils. With every new master came a new book and plan of instruction. Some light is thrown upon the vexed question of the state of religious houses at this momentous time. Nothing more deterred the founders of those places of religion, or those who might intend to become founders, than to find their homes maintaining a smaller number of residents than according to their original foundation or present income they ought to maintain. It was enjoined upon the ordinaries and extraordinaries that a proper number should be kept up, and kept up perpetually. Unquestionably, one of the signs of the decay of the monastic system was the tendency of the monks to aggregate themselves in their great houses, where they had more society and comfort, to the neglect of their remoter dependencies, from which they drew the rents without affording the benefits of their presence. It is probable also that the actual number of the religious was decreasing, and in their general tone, the ordinances which we are considering seem to acknowledge the decline of monasteries. For the reformation of them, it was ordered that a sufficient instructor in grammar and other primitive sciences should be maintained in every religious house, that the more apt of the religious should be regularly sent to the universities, and that the abbots and priors should carefully train their subjects in the rules constitutions, and ceremonies of their order, and appoint them in their offices according to ability and disposition, whether within the cloisters or outdoors. The superiors had not always an easy task, may be judged from the following article. Apostates or runaways who had lapsed into the world were to be received back with charity if they repented, with the somewhat surprising exception of those who appeared to the ordinary of the place from vehement signs and tokens to have conspired against the life of their superiors or brethren, or to be likely to conspire in the future. No religious person who had broken the 3 vows was to be allowed to leave the monastery or to accept any benefice, charge, or chantry through any dispensation, or even of the apostolic see, were it even granted under the bull of lead, unless it were proved to the ordinary to have been granted upon true and just grounds. A list was added of seditious and heretical books which were condemned and proscribed. They included those that had been condemned previously by the commission of the year 1530, with many that had appeared since, the works of the German heretics, and those of the act of Tyndale and his coadjutors. Among them was the first work of John Frith, the future martyr, entitled The Disputation of Purgatory, and the list was closed, memorably enough, with the Confession of Augsburg. The examples above gathered from these statutes or ordinances of the clergy may be sufficient to show that the clerical reformation was not intended to have been slight or partial. The worst evils were boldly handled. The most solemn admonitions might have armed with more active zeal the ordinaries, to whom was committed the keeping of the church. On them indeed depended all, but their hands might have been strengthened while their authority was maintained by the opinion of the laity, expressed in Parliament or elsewhere, if no more had been within the compass of the times than the restoration of the pristine discipline. The declining power of the Pope, to whom the clergy showed themselves little disposed to pay a blind obedience, the partial recovery of the Church from the intrusion of foreigners, which had troubled her ever since the conquest, and the peace of the country, now respiring after long civil wars, might have given the prospect of a moderate and steady reformation. But while the clergy were exhorting the ordinaries to do their duty, they were startled from their dreams of self-government by the arrival of the supplication of the commons against the ordinaries. This important accusation was received by the Archbishop on the 12th of April, with an intimation that the king required it to be answered quickly. It was therefore sent down to the lower house of Convocation, in which, indeed, there sat more ordinaries than in the upper house, and an answer was expected to be ready by the next session, April 15th. On that day, several answers were read in the upper house, which had been conceived in the lower, to the preamble or preface of the supplication, or rather perhaps one answer to the several parts of the preface, and along with this, answers to 2 portions of the first article of the supplication itself. The clergy seem to have had no time to frame a formal answer to the whole, nor indeed was this necessary, since the true meaning of all was comprised in the first part, in which the independence of their convocation as a synod was attacked. Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, read the answers and corrected them, from whom he had obtained the reputation of being the author of them. These answers were unanimously approved by the upper house and received the assent of the lower house at the next session, April 19. They composed the first answer of the Ordinaries to the Supplication of the Commons. General assertions unsupported by proofs can only be met by general denials and demand of instances. The Commons had declared that there was a great daily widening breach between the temporal and spiritual subjects of the king. Discord, strife, and variance of which there seemed to be no end. To declare a breach is to make one, and this has been the favorite device of agitators from that day to this. The clergy answered that upon their hearts and consciences there was no such breach, debate, or variance on their part. The king's subjects were their ghostly children, whom they loved and ever should love with hearty affection, never intending harm to their souls and bodies, nor having enterprised anything against them. I've got a footnote here. All this relates to the first answer of the Ordinaries, which only extended formally to the preface and first article, or part of the first article. But of this first answer, there are 3 manuscripts, somewhat different. The shortest is in the Cotton Library, which has been partly transcribed by Atterbury. This one taken by Wilkins from the Register of Convocation. Okay, it's a discussion of 3 different texts. We will call that here. Glory be to the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost.